Thank you, Senator Ord, and thank everyone for being here, and thank the college for providing us with this space. Waiting for tech guy to help me out here. I have an imaginary clicker, and I'm going to imagine and I'm clicking. Okay, I just imagined that I'm clicking. See, it works. Our slideshows are going to be available by PDF, so I have somewhere around 80 slides in this deck. This is about a third of the slides that I could have brought. I can speak 3 to 4 hours. I have 20 minutes. So we're going to zing right through this stuff. If you have any questions, my name and contact information will be on the last slide, and I'm pretty easy to find on the internet too. My business is randacoustics.com, so you can just go there and contact me if you have questions. What distinguishes me, I suppose, as being able to talk to you about power plant noise is that I worked as a power plant noise consultant, including 10 years at Stone & Webster in Boston, designing electric power plants. For a couple, 2.5 years or so, I was the silencer specialist for Stone & Webster. So I was in charge of all contracts for all silencing for all power plants everywhere in the world for 2.5 years for Stone & Webster. So I learned a lot about contracts. I learned a lot about materials, steel, concrete, contracts, you name it. As far as wind turbines, I've been looking at those since 2009, and I am sensitive to motion sickness. I get motion sickness on boats, and I've experienced motion sickness at several wind turbine facilities. Two in particular I stayed overnight at, Falmouth and Shirley. I'm going to talk about those later. At Falmouth, I had about 7 weeks to recover. After that study, I had to get special glasses. I lost sight in one eye for about a week. And I experienced something called spatial disorientation, and so did my colleague Steve Ambrose, where we thought, so if you look at the world and you say, I'm looking at something, let's say I'm looking at the P in professional, well, my brain would say, well, that P is actually up there. If you could look fast enough, it would be up there. So I experienced really substantial vestibular impacts at Falmouth, not quite as severe at Shirley, and also down in Aruba at Vader Pete, and in New York here at Hardscrabble. I am in that 10% of the population that's immediately susceptible. I would not be able to live anywhere near a wind farm. For distances, following up with Jerry's discussion, I have 2 communities or general areas, one in Wisconsin, one in Colorado, where neighbors report that they have to be 4 miles away now that they're sensitized before they can gain relief. Yes, okay. I have resources as a noise control consultant. One of, or maybe the most important resource is ethics. As a member of INSEE, we have a canon of ethics, and the canon 1 is hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. That trumps everything else in the work that I do. If I'm thinking about something, considering materials, considering setbacks, considering noise levels, even considering how I'm going to make a chart, what I'm going to present in a chart, I'm always thinking along these lines. It's built into the job. It's not optional. Now, you can get confused when you see an INSEE member who might be consulting for an application, and they might not be providing you any evidence that they're following this canon. That could be very confusing. Next slide, please. So the 2 basic categories for work are to meet regulations, follow the law, and hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. I have some resources including that consist of direct and acquired knowledge. Direct knowledge is from professional experience designing plants and consulting. We have a great resource in the World Health Organization, in the American National Standards Institute, who provide voluntary consensus standards for all kinds of equipment and processes in the United States, They have a whole set of standards on sound. I will be referring to S12.9 to give guidance on how to properly cite for compatibility with land use later in the slide set. I'm going to have to move faster, I can tell. Next slide, please. Okay, we are dealing with a major noise problem. The scale of wind turbine noise in the United States is not unsimilar to what happened when jet aircraft started proliferating. Although what I'm seeing in the wind turbine deployment is there's very little to no noise impact assessment occurring from the applicants. Wind turbines are promoted as pollution-free. Most people think wind turbines are silent. And that's my direct experience. When I talk to people about wind turbines, they go, they make noise? No. They make noise. It's mostly rural areas that they get built. Regulators, out of necessity for the regulatory process to be fair, use meters to measure decibels. But meters cannot measure impacts. Next slide, please. Here's a map of the United States from a federal database of turbine locations. And those are all the colored dots. These are colored by how recently they were built. Next slide, please. Here's New York State. This may not be entirely complete. They try to stay up to date. Next slide, please. Now, those first two maps were a little abstract, like that map of the United States. Okay, where am I? New York. Okay, but where are we right now? And this isn't where we are right now, but this is in near Hardscrabble. And you might be able, if you're careful, you might be able to see the shadows of wind turbines here and there. And there are some homes here. Now you can't see the distance legend scale down at the bottom because of the way this table is set up. But let's go to the next slide. And this is an overlay showing the predicted noise levels from the applicant. And the green boxes are homes. And let's see, I'll get out my little pointer here. Okay, so that's a turbine, and this is roughly 50 dBA, and this is roughly 45 here, and this is 40 here. You know, Jerry's been talking about, well, 40, above 40 you get sleep impacts for healthy individuals. So if you take a quick look here, you can say, well, everyone's got predicted noise levels above 40. Why are they doing that? Everyone's going to have sleep problems. Next slide, please. So this brings us to citing criteria. Next slide, please. This slide, I could sit on this slide for the rest of my 15 minutes. Okay, 13 minutes. I'm going to read it. Most problems observed in wind turbine siting including misleading marketing, regulations loosened, and we have observed sometimes years before the application goes in. Good neighbor agreements, poor noise models, lack of noise impact assessments, unenforced noise regulations, noise complaints, and even legal action stem from the primary design deficiency of wind turbines. Distance has proved to be the only reliable noise control option available for wind turbines so far. In most places, there isn't enough distance to avoid impacts. I'll read that one more time because if this is the only thing you get, I really want you to get this. As a noise control consultant who has looked at this really carefully with full knowledge of all the various noise controls there are for all kinds of power production in use in the US today, distance has proved to be the only reliable noise control option available for wind turbines so far. In most places, there isn't enough distance to avoid impacts. Next slide, please. So what are noise citing criteria? Well, I go down through this. But basically, noise citing criteria were designed to protect human health and welfare. Next slide, please. The International Standards Organization, or ISO, developed a basic guideline to determine the degree of impact in communities. If you increase the noise over the background by 5 dB, you get a few complaints. 10, widespread complaints. 15, threats of community action. And 20, you're getting in your truck and you're going over there and something's going to happen. Next slide, please. Background sound levels in rural areas, which is almost 100% where turbines go. There are a few. There's a turbine in Hull, Massachusetts, under the air, a glide path for Logan Airport. It's pretty noisy there. People don't complain. But mostly it's rural areas. Quiet at night. I'm in Brunswick, Maine. That's one of the biggest towns in Maine. 11,000 people. I can take my meter out at night and I can pin the noise floor of the meter. I'm down at 16 dBA at night. However, wind turbines are permitted up at 40, 45, 50, 55, even 60 or 65 dBA, either at the nearest property line or at the home. Although zoning laws generally respect the property line, in a lot of cases, wind turbine noise is permitted at the home. I've never figured that one out. But I think it has to do with the previous slide. Distance is the only reliable noise control option, and they don't have the distance. So if you design far louder than the background, you're going to get reactions. And when a facility produces complaints, appeals to stop the noise, and lawsuits, consultants and regulators have failed. There's no gray area here. Next slide, please. Here's ANSI S 12.9. Spreadsheet I did using the arithmetic contained in the ANSI standard. This is a standard to determine noise levels for a new intrusive noise source, and in this case, in a quiet rural area. Hope you can see all the numbers, but basically what it boils down to is the long-term average noise level should not exceed 30 at night. That's compatible in a quiet rural area. Should not exceed 40 during the day. Next slide, please. Jerry talked about the World Health Organization. This is a slide directly from their executive summary from 2009, basically listing 3 categories of health impact ranges. Under 30, no impact. Between 30 and 40, they're getting some effects on sleep, and more so for risk populations, children, elderly, people with pre-existing conditions. Above 40 for healthy individuals. You've got sleep interference. Next slide, please. Now we get to where the real problem is, because it's indoors. When you're trying to sleep, you're not sleeping out on the lawn, although I have a number of clients who did that before they ended up abandoning their home, because they couldn't sleep indoors. So this is a test in Vermont. The question was, how much is the noise dropping to go inside when it goes inside the house? This is called the outside to inside level reduction. Next slide, please. Why do we do this? Well, the wind industry models average noise levels. And testing was in Vermont. And Vermont had included for this project an indoors limit of average 30 dBA. They assumed a 15 dB reduction, is what I understand. And, but the testing that they did showed that the reduction was only 1 to 6 dB. So they were wrong. The neighbors complained. There were appeals to stop the noise, and the house was not livable. So the testing yielded real limits for house level reduction assumptions. What happens when it goes outside to inside when it's wind turbine noise? This is also useful for assessing LMAX sleep impacts. So you take the outside level maximum, if you've tested a house or you use this as an example, -1 to -6, then you can subtract that from your measured maximum outdoor noise. You have the maximum indoor noise, and may we have the next slide, please. We have the WHO guidelines for LMAX indoors, which show effects starting at 32 and going up to 42. Now, if I add 1 to 6 dB to that, now I'm in a site criteria for maximum noise outside, which is in the high 30s generally for these biological effects. Next slide, please. We come now to annoyance. Jerry talked about annoyance. Annoyance was defined by Health Canada study director David Michaud, and basically said it's real. It's something we pay attention to. Next slide. Then they went out and measured in a $2 million study, and they found that indeed, now Jerry already showed this graph, but basically when you get within about a kilometer, the annoyance jumps an order of magnitude. Next slide, please. And the WHO considers it an environmental health burden. Next slide. It's also defined by the WHO as a nuisance. Now this is important because we don't, in the US, we don't know what annoyance is. I'm annoyed because they didn't do the pattern right on my latte. I'm really annoyed by that. We don't understand what they mean by annoyance. Annoyance is a health condition. It's not a, my latte isn't right. Next slide, please. So what we have here is a picture of the decision in Falmouth, Massachusetts to shut down the 2 turbines owned by the town of Falmouth, and it was based on a finding of nuisance, and that was for noise levels that exceeded 40. That took 7 years and several $100,000. I think it was $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, maybe more, of the neighbors' money to get relief. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. So we have some very good references for outdoor noise. This is from Hubbard, 1982. ANSI has somewhat similar levels codified in the ANSI S12 standards. There's a little tricky part to this. As investigators, we're looking at the maximum levels, and there's been this bit of smoothing going on where wind industry likes to see things at average. And the difference between max and average is a lot. So it's a little bit tricky when you get down to the details of how do you implement a good limit. Next slide. This slide, Steve Ambrose and I, we studied in Falmouth. We provided this to the Technical Committee 43 of the Acoustical Society of America in 2015. Very simple. We overlaid the EPA test cases from the early 70s, adjusted for quiet rural areas, using their algorithms for doing that, with the high annoyance data from Pedersen, which is a stringently peer-reviewed set of data. And basically, can you guys see the x-axis at all? Can you see it? Oh, you can see it up there. Okay, great. So those numbers along the bottom are the same numbers that you would see if you look at an application and they predict 47 dB at somebody's home. That's a LEQ. That could be a predicted level. It could also be a measured level. So you can, with this chart, you can look at any application. You could look at any suggestion. If an applicant comes in and says, we would like our limit to be 50, and then you can look at this and say, well, what do I expect from that? If you want 50 and my nearest neighbors are at 48, what can I expect for a reaction? Strong appeals to stop the noise, very high annoyance. Okay, thanks for offering. Next slide, please. So above 35 under ANSI standards, you're incompatible in quiet rural areas. Now this is for any new intrusive unfamiliar noise source. ANSI is agnostic. They're not talking about wind turbines or gas turbines or ethanol plants or any, they don't single anything out. This is for any new, intrusive, unfamiliar noise source in a quiet rural area. Don't go over 35 because it won't be compatible. Next slide. This slide summarizes that, plus the sleep impacts for healthy individuals. And as we said earlier, you can get sleep impacts starting at 35-ish for people with pre-existing conditions. Next slide, please. Okay, there is a disconnect, yes. Next slide. Most people think wind turbines are silent. Or do you think? Okay, next slide. And they think it's clean energy. And next slide. Well, why would they think that? Look what they get on the television. Look what they get. This is a very feel-good ad. Next slide. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to search for clean energy on Google. What do I get? It's all wind turbines. Okay, there is a solar panel down here in the corner. Oh, there's a solar panel there too. But it's wind turbines all over the place. What's someone supposed to think? Oh, wind turbines are clean. Okay, next slide. So I looked at the 2015 New York State Energy Plan. I read it. There is no mention of noise, no stated plan to reduce or control noise pollution, health impacts on communities, children, or elderly. They mention environmental justice communities. Those seem to exclude communities where people would be living near wind turbines. Next slide, please. This is actually an entire page in that document. There are no words. There isn't even a page number. It's just a picture of turbines. You notice how they're all pointing in different directions? It's like people standing at a museum looking at different pieces of art. When you look at that, what do you hear? I hear nothing. It's quiet. There's no noise. Next slide. Now we come to the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, and this really is something because they are charged with preventing and controlling pollution, and at the same time, you can see that they apparently are also charged with promoting clean wind turbine energy. It just doesn't work. There's a disconnect. Next slide. I saw this news article from September 6. Evan Davis, in the last 6 months following the Arkwright Wind Project, we've had a major increase in referrals of patients with idiopathic vestibular issues. That's like what I experienced, Steve experienced at Falmouth. Syncope, that's apparently fainting because you lost blood pressure to your head. Migraines, seizures, and strokes. And then at the same time, we have Doug Fairbanks, chairman of the planning board, saying, I've got no problems with them. I wake up with them. I love them. It's a good thing for the community. Now, surely he does not mean that it's a good thing for the community to be increasing the number of vestibular issues, syncope, migraines, seizures, and strokes. But how are we to know that? Next slide, please. Okay, wind turbine noise. I'm going to have to go even faster. Are you with me? Let's go. All right. Okay, this is a slide from the American and Canadian Wind Energy Associations. Basically, they're really big. They swirl around. They make a lot of noise with their blades. Next slide. This is from a European study quoted by Mima. I won't even try to say her name. But basically, the noise, the highest amount of noise is not coming from the center where they model from. It's coming from another location. And there are a lot of other details which I don't show here. Certain types of noise tends to go sideways, and low frequency noise tends to go this way, like a big dipole. A dipole is like a speaker in your cabinet. Next slide. So wind turbines produce mostly low frequency noise. I've got a little tiny type in there, and you might not be able to read it here, but basically if you A-weight, which means you're filtering, so if I A-weight, this basically ends up going like that and gone. This is all cut out by the A-weighting filter. The A-weighted reading on the meter is only getting 1% of the energy coming from the turbine. Next slide. I created this for, well, a version of this for the Shirley study. This basically shows that as turbines used to be pretty small, 30 kilowatts, 100 kilowatts, 130 kilowatts, 200 kilowatts, 300 kilowatts. That's what was in Europe when they were doing the annoyance studies back in the early 2000s. They've gotten much, 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 much bigger, and as they get bigger, the rotation necessarily slows down. The blade pass rate, as blades go by the tower, that slows down, and it moves into what we call the nauseogenic range. That's the range that is identified as where people can get triggered into motion sickness. Next slide. This is verbiage that tells you what's going on with the turbines. Next slide. And there's more verbiage, but basically what is going on with the thumping at night is now understood due to very fancy computer modeling. Next slide. Okay, noise impacts. Next slide. Wind turbines disturb sleep. I think we're all getting a feeling for that now. Now this is from the early 2000s with tiny turbines compared to where they are now. Next slide. And they cause noise complaints, and sleep disturbance was the primary complaint. Next slide. There's been suggestions through some people worldwide that people are making this up. Now I can tell you from my direct experience, this is not made up. No, I didn't spend 7 weeks recovering making that up. If I go up the stairs and I turn around and I almost pass out because I'm so dizzy, I wasn't making that up. Next slide. And we have testing of badgers to confirm that it is not, nocebo is not there, because badgers experience the same issues with increases in cortisol near wind farms, wind facilities, as people. Next one. In Ontario in 2011, the regulatory authority, Ministry of the Environment agreed, the Environmental Review Tribunal agreed, that the evidence demonstrates turbines can cause harm if they're too close. It's come down to an issue of degree, how much harm. Next slide. Studies. Okay, now we're going to go even faster because I've only got like 20 seconds. Okay, this is the Falmouth Study. Next slide. So we did what Jerry was talking about. Go in, get sick, go away, feel better. Go in, get sick, go away, feel better. Go in. We did that for 3 days and 2 nights. We didn't know what we were going to run into, but we ended up describing basically, I believe it's called a case series or a longitudinal. I'm not a statistician, so. We arrived at the site. The power levels were high. We got sick. The power levels went way down. We were able to sleep. The power levels went up during the day. We were sick. And by sick, I mean nauseous, dizzy, headaches, inability to concentrate, and that spatial disorientation, which was really strange. And we also wanted to just run out of the house. It felt really weird to be in the house. Next slide. What we noticed that was unusual and distinct compared to all other power sources that we have measured over our combined 70, 80 years together, working in power generation, indoors the unweighted level went up, and as we would expect, the A-weighted level went down. It was so low we couldn't hear the turbines inside the house. Next slide. This scale is in Pascal, so this is the raw data to emphasize the difference outdoors and indoors. Indoors, everything's going on like this, like a whole house cavity response. Next slide. This slide is showing linear C and A weighting. All the energy is in the very, very low frequencies. Just like we saw for the Vestas turbine, most of the energy, almost all of it, is low frequency. Next slide. This is a description of the spatial disorientation I had. You can read it, you can write to me, you can say, what were you talking about? Anytime you want. None of my colleagues working for the wind industry have contacted me in the last 10 years, 8 years, to ask me what happened. Next slide. Our findings were that the vestibular system appears to be stimulated. Planning include a margin of safety, which is what we always did at Stone & Webster. It would be standard operating procedure. Next slide. Shirley, 2012. Next slide. This was written by the guy Bruce Walker, Dr. Bruce Walker, who was handling all the instrumentation of microphones. Residents report being intensely affected despite inaudibility. They couldn't hear the turbines. And just like us in Falmouth. And to be aware of a turbine operation when the turbines are not visible. And I met a number of them there. Absolutely. They could tell without fail. Next slide. There are some summaries here. I will not read them. But the third paragraph you should read. This is 4 firms agreeing there is a huge problem. That was 7 years ago. Next slide. This is my conclusion, and what I concluded was that nauseogenicity, now that's a mouthful, basically something is capable of making people sick, made me sick. At Shirley, due to acceleration on the inner ear. Schomer, who was one of the team members, went on to do a paper in 2015 that determined it was force on the inner ear. Next slide. And this is his paper, and he basically suggested that there's a relation between wind turbines and motion sickness in what appears to be a fraction of those exposed, and we estimated somewhere around 5–10%. I'm definitely in that category. Next slide. And this is a problem that's been known for decades. This is not new, and it's not unique to wind turbines, with the exception that there have never been so many pieces of equipment permitted, installed, and operating as wind turbines. Next slide. Sick building syndrome in the 1970s from, I've definitely gone over, I'm going to get it. Okay, next slide. Again, Hubbard defined the problem. Noise enters the house, causes vibration. Next slide. He defined areas and levels down in the very low range, below 100 hertz, where people can sense low frequency noise below the hearing threshold. This is not new information for acousticians. For the public, this may be new, and it's really great that you're seeing this. Next slide. I have this in twice. I don't. Okay, but this is very important because no one is twisting anyone's arm to install a 5 megawatt turbine or a 3 megawatt turbine. As they've gotten larger, the problem has become exacerbated. Next slide. ISO 9996. This is an international standard that associates motion sickness to perceived or actual oscillations in the range where wind turbine blade pass frequencies occur. They don't say that, but that is what's happening. The blade pass rates have dropped into the range associated with motion sickness in ISO 9996. Next slide. Department of ENT Head and Neck Surgery, Wales, UK, has determined that there's evidence that infrasound has a physiological effect on the ear. It's impossible to conclude it does not cause the symptoms. Next slide. And then recently, in Germany, they've determined that infrasound near the hearing threshold. So if you get pressure crossing, so here's my hearing threshold, you've got pressure crossing over it. That turns out to be significant, very significant. And what do we have with wind turbines? We have pulsations. Next slide. Wind turbines and surf. I tested. This is Falmouth, and this is Aruba. No, it is Aruba. Okay, it's Aruba. But I had the same recurring pulsations in the same intensity, but not the same rate. The rate coming in was outside the range associated to motion sickness. Next slide. So noise complaints are for indoors noise. When people complain they can't sleep, again, it's because it's indoors. Regulations are set for outdoors noise, mostly. We have this exception in Vermont, but mostly it's outdoor noise. Next slide. This is a test indoors on Nantucket using the Danish LPA LF, Indoors Industrial Noise Standard, which is source agnostic, doesn't care what it is. Denmark did include wind turbines as a source that must be regulated with this standard in 2012. Big objections from the wind industry about that, but to no avail. They are now regulated the same way. So what we have is 20 dBA of low frequencies. You want to stay under that to avoid high annoyance. And in this house where people were appealing to stop the noise from a 100 kilowatt turbine, the noise was peaking up to 30. Okay, next slide. Mr. Leventhal, the acoustician who's testified with the wind industry in 2004, indicated that they might adopt protective strategies. Next slide. And there's that's the kicker. That's the one you want to understand. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. This is in Australia. This is Simon Ramsey. He was promoting wind energy until they wanted to put some turbines near his home, and then he started objecting, and he wanted them 2 kilometers away. It's about 6,500 feet. It actually didn't work. He didn't prevail. Next slide. This is a slide from a neighbor in Falmouth at about 1,400 feet. And her appeals were ignored. Next slide. That's it.